In this module, I would like to discuss how to define and how to compute a competitive equilibrium in an economy that has a representative agent, a representative firm, and there's going to be basically two markets that we are going to focus on today, which are the market for consumption goods and the market and the labor market. We are going for the moment to abstract from the capital market, because to talk more meaningfully about capital, we would like to have an economy that lasts for more than one period. So in terms of the competitive equilibrium, we are going to focus on the final goods market, and we are going to focus on the labor market. So remember that when we think about these markets, we have two sides of the market, demand and the supply, and firms or consumers are going to be in different sides of the market depending on which type of market we are discussing. So let me just briefly summarize what we've done in other modules, because that's going to help us define the equilibrium. So in previous modules, we analyzed the consumer problem, and basically what we said is, imagine that we have a consumer that cares about consumption and leisure. These are the two variables that the consumer chooses, and it's subject to the constraint that the total amount of consumption has to be equal to her total disposable income. So the income is the sum of the labor income, the profit that the firm that the consumer gets from the firms, and its disposable income because the individual pay taxes T. So what we found in previous modules is that the individual is going to equate the cost and benefits of exerting one more hour of work. Remember, the number of works that the agent is going to provide to the market is the difference between the total endowment of hours, which we denoted by H, and the amount of leisure that the individual chooses. So here, N, or the labor supply, is going to be determined as a residual. And the optimality condition states that the slope of the indifference curve, which we call the marginal rate of substitution, has to be equal to the slope of the budget constraint of this individual. So this is the budget constraint, and this whole thing we call CP, which is basically the consumer problem decision. So when we solve this consumer problem, what we find is the labor supply of an individual that depends, among other things, on the wage rate. What we said is that this wage rate is going to be upward sloping as long as the substitution effect exceeds the income effect, and this is discussed a bit more thoroughly in other modules. But basically, whether the substitution effect dominates the income effect or not is going to depend both on the shape of the utility function and the amount of after-tax income that the individual has. Okay, the other thing that we discuss is the firm's problem. So what is the firm doing? So the firm, we said, and let's call FP the maximization problem of the firm is trying to maximize profits. And it's maximizing profits by choosing how much labor to hire. So what is profits? Profits is going to be the total amount of production that the firm chooses minus the total amount of labors that it needs to hire. So this part here is the revenues that the firm makes by selling the final good to consumers, and these are going to be the variable costs of the firm, which is the total amount paid to workers per hour times the total amount of hours that the firm chooses to hire. And how is the firm producing output? That's given by her technology, and that's going to be a function of capital and labor. But for now, as I said, let's imagine that capital is constant, so we are not going to worry too much about capital. And we are going to think of the production function as mostly moving with labor. So this thing here is a technology, and this thing here is what we call total factor productivity, which is increasing or decreasing the total level of production given a combination of capital and labor. So what do we obtain out of the firm problem? Well, very much like with the consumer, we are going to have an optimality condition that is going to state that the firm is going to hire workers up to the point where the marginal product of labor, which is the benefit of hiring an extra worker, is equal to the wage rate, which is the cost of hire that extra worker. And remember that the marginal product of labor, which we denote MPN, is just the derivative of production with respect to N, or Fn times Z. Okay? And if given the assumptions that we made out of the production function, we are going to find a labor demand, which we can denote ND as a function of W, to be downward sloping. So basically what this says is that the firm, of course, hiring worker gives the firm more production. So because the marginal product of labor is always positive, but because the marginal product of labor is decreasing, so the production function has diminishing returns to scale, the labor demand is going to be downward sloping. So the more expensive it is to hire workers, the less you are going to hire workers in the end. Now, the final piece of the puzzle here is the government. Basically, we've up to now thought of the government as a somewhat passive agent, and we will continue to do so for now. So what is the decision problem? Well, the government is not deciding much. We are going to assume that the government has to spend some money G, that we are not for the moment endogenize. The endogenation of the government decision is something that is studied a lot in public finance. For now, we are just going to assume that the government needs to spend this amount G, and that is going to finance it with lump sum taxes. So basically, all the government is doing is satisfying the government budget constraint that states that the total amount of taxes has to be enough to cover her expenditures. And this is a balanced budget because, as we see, we are imposing that the government must make enough tax revenues every period, the T, to finance G without borrowing. Later on, we are going to relax this assumption and we are going to start thinking about an environment where there is a possibility of debt. So what do we want to focus on? We want to, today, what we want to do is we want to define a competitive equilibrium. Then we are going to later on in a different module think about how to solve for it, and in a yet later module we are going to discuss how changes in the environment are going to affect this equilibrium. Now, what are we doing in general? The following. So we have a model now, and in this model there are some things that are going to be exogenous variables that we are not going to model at this moment, but maybe they can be endogenized later. So what are our exogenous variables? They are going to be the amount that the government must spend at every period, the state of the economy, whether the economy with the same amount of capital and labor can produce a lot or a little, the total factor productivity, and as I said, for now, the level of capital, which is going to be fixed in this very short run model. Now, what does the model tell us? The model tells us how the different agents in the economy are going to behave. And here the different agents are consumers, producers, and the government. What are we going to get? So the exogenous variables are inputs to our model. Our model determines through objective functions, for consumers the utility function, for producers the profits, and for the government the objective of having to spend G star. Tell us what the optimal decisions are going to be and what are we going to get out of the model, what are going to be our outcomes. They are going to be values for our endogenous variables. And what our endogenous variables? There's going to be an amount of consumption that the individuals are going to have on aggregate. We are going to determine the equilibrium amount that agents supply and firms demand. We are going to determine the level of taxes trivially from the government budget constraint. we are going to determine the level of production, and we are going to determine wages. Now notice that this is important when we are thinking about the equilibrium relative to the problem of an individual. So one individual in this economy, say the consumer, is always going to take wages as given, because we assume that consumers are very insignificant, they have small mass, they live in a competitive equilibrium, so they don't determine the wage rate that they get paid. Same thing with firms. When firms go to the market and try to hire workers, an assumption here is that the firm is a small firm and does not determine neither the prices at which goods are sold nor the wages that at which it can hire workers. So for the agents in our model, for our agents that live, so all the little firms and all the little consumers in this economy, all of them are going to take wages as given. Now, what happens when we define the equilibrium? Well, when we think of the equilibrium will be such that the wage is going to be the one that is going to make sort of supply and demand equal to each other in the labor market. So the wage is going to be an exogenous variable for an agent, but it is an endogenous variable in terms of our model. Okay, so what is the key concept? Let me put here, the key concept when we think of equilibrium is the concept of consistency. And basically what we are going to require is that given market prices, demand and supply are going to be equal to each other in each of the markets that we are going to consider, which in this case are the labor market and the goods market. So in other words, we are going to say that in equilibrium, market's clear. There's no excess demand and no excess supply. So let me define properly a competitive equilibrium here. So what is a competitive equilibrium? Well, we are going to say, given our exogenous parameters, which is the TFP or the state of the economy, government purchases, and the amount of capital, a competitive equilibrium is a set of endogenous quantities, which are going to be, again, the level of consumption of each individual, the amount of labor that the individual chooses, the amount of leisure that the individual chooses, the demand for labor of the firm, the amount of taxes that the government taxes or collects every period, the level of production, and the amount of dividends that firms hand in, and endogenous prices, which in this case, there's going to be only one endogenous price, which is the wage rate. Why is this? Because we assume that our consumption good is the numeraire, so we are defining everything in sort of real terms, in terms of the price of that good. So when we think of the price here, the wage, which is again the wage rate, when we think of the wage rate, again, remember, we are thinking about the real wage rate. So how much an individual is paid in terms of production goods for each hour that it works. And these have to be such that, and these are going to be our competitive equilibrium conditions. So given the level of equilibrium taxes, given the level of dividends, and given the equilibrium wage rate, let me put a star here, the consumption bundle CL is going to solve the consumer problem that we define above, and the supply of labor is going to be the one that satisfies the time constraint. Okay, so what does the individual take as given? The individual takes as given everything that the individual does not choose. and the individual taking those things as given is going to make her optimal choices. Second, given the amounts of TFP, given the level of capital, which we assume was fixed, and given the wage rate, the firm solves her optimization problems, and that determines the optimal demand for capital, such that and the total amount of production and the total amount of profits. From which conditions? Well, the total amount of production is going to be the total amount that the firm produces given the level of capital and her optimal demand for labor. The profits are going to be the difference between this total production and the amount that the firm is paying to workers for being hired. So again, how do we find the demand for labor? We basically need to solve the firm's problem. And finally, we have the other equilibrium condition. So what do we need to determine? So let me just put some colors. We said how C star is determined, determined from the consumer problem. We talked about how the supply of labor is solved from the consumer problem and the optimal amount of leisure. So all these orange decisions are going to be determined by consumers given everything else in the market. Now, the demand for labor, the production, and the profits are going to come from firms, okay? By solving the firm problem. When you solve the firm problems, given everything else, these three things are going to be determined. So what are we still missing? Well, we are missing the level of taxes. So taxes must satisfy the government budget constraint, which says that T star has to trivially be equal to G. In more complicated problems, this condition 3 is going to be more involved. And then the final, so what are we missing? We have all the allocations. The only thing we are missing is the wage rate. So how is the wage rate determined? So the wage rate is determined such that the market for labor clears. And what does this mean? This basically means that the wage is going to be the one that makes the demand for labor, which of course is a function of a wage, equal to the supply of labor, which is another function of the wage. So remember what I said before, if we have W in the y-axis and N in the n-axis, and the substitution effect dominates the income effect, our labor supply is upward sloping. And then from the firm problem, our labor demand is downward sloping. So what is W star? W star is the point at which supply meets demand. In other words, what this is saying is that the wage rate has to be just enough to make to make consumers supply exactly what firms want to hire, and the wage has to be just right so that consumers want to supply exactly the amount of labor that firms want to hire. So in other words, in equilibrium, there's going to be one value of N, and that when we impose this condition, we are going to be able to find the level W star, which is the value at which there's no excess supply or excess demand. So then let's just remember, where does this ND come from? This ND come from the firms. Where does the NS come from? This one comes from consumers. Where does the W come from? This comes from the optimality condition. So basically, this concludes the description of how a competitive equilibrium is defined. What we are going to do next is we are going to do an algebraic example so we understand how each one of these components is determined and how they are all put together to find the equilibrium.